My name is Kenji Totoki. I'm Deputy Director General of Cabinet Office Japan and in charge of the Vice Chair of IFNEC Steering Group and the co-chair of one of its working groups, NSCCEG. Japan is hosting today's webinar on SMR financing, and I'm taking a role of the co-host together with the Secretariat of IFNEC, with the assistance of the facilitator, Mr. Mikita. IFNEC originally planned an in-person workshop on SMRs in Jordan this June. However, affected by the pandemic of COVID-19, we postponed the in-person workshop for a while. Instead, we decided to organize this webinar series in order to keep our momentum towards the future in-person activities, such as in Kenya, where IFNEC's several meetings are going to be held in November this year. As you already know, today's topic is SMR finance. It's one of the most important topics, which now IFNEC is intensively dealing with. The objective of this webinar is announced to discuss various financing scheme options, such as industrial financing and government financing. The discussion will also address how financing entities evaluate nuclear projects, especially in emerging countries, how the modularity in SMR contributes to the simplification of the regulatory scheme and to the reduction of financing risks to acceptable levels. Financing would be one of the most vital elements in actually implementing SMR projects. SMRs would have some advantageous features for financing, such as being safer than conventional large-scale reactors technologically, or highly possible lower construction costs. Moreover, there should be many other things to address in terms of SMR financing, as we have not seen any of the entire SMR project yet. Therefore, we will focus on SMR financing today. Each speaker today has a distinguished background and expertise regarding nuclear financing and SMRs. Through an active discussion among them and the facilitator, we will specify some of the key issues for the future research and discussion. Personally, I also expect this webinar would be a great opportunity to study SMR financing for myself. Before starting the panel, let me briefly introduce today's facilitator, Mr. Satoshi Mikita. Satoshi is Director of New Energy Power Finance Department 1 at JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. He is responsible for financing projects overseas, covering both conventional and advanced risks. His current portfolio also includes global business development in infrastructure areas such as smart energy, hydrogen, and off-grids. He also has the experience in policy side of nuclear finance, not only in the JBIC headquarters, but also in its Washington, D.C. office. He joined JBIC in 1997 and started his career as a loan officer for the Middle East and Africa, providing financial service to IPP projects and foreign governments. His career also includes energy and natural resource finance, marine and aerospace finance, and the second went to the private banking sector of Japan. He has rich experience in international finance. I believe he is the best person to facilitate the discussion with due attention to the differences among the countries in the business environment. Now we'd like to move on to the panel. Mr. Mikita, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Totoki-san, for the kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Satoshi Mikita, and please let me thank everyone for today's opportunity. Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, is, together with NEXI, the Export Credit Agency of Japan, positioned in between the public sector and the private sector, and also in between the sponsors and the private financiers. We work in most of the sectors you can think of, and nowadays many of our transactions are on a project finance basis that I am sure will be the baseline of today's discussion, considering today's theme, the private and public options. The issues raised in last week's webinar to develop the SMR market, such as first-of-a-kind risk, licensing, regulatory, sustainability, etc., are all in line with financiers' aspects when viewing SMR financing. SMR is a chance for nuclear to become a commodity like aircraft, was mentioned by Mr. Bill Magwood, the NEA Director General, and it was very impressive to me. So for the last 1 week, I had in mind how can SMR finance can also become a commodity. For the concept of today's discussions, it would take at least a full day if we are to discuss SMR financing with our great panelists today. But in order to make the most of a 90-minute webinar, our two goals today would be to share with you the expert's view on where SMR financing stands in the infrastructure finance and also the project finance arena, and to highlight the areas that we will dive into when we have the full spec conference next time. To achieve the goals, please allow me to set one hypothesis. That is, will SMR finance be somewhere in between conventional IPP finance and financing for large-scale reactors? Regarding conventional IPP finance, although there are challenges in individual deals, the general structure of the finance itself and its major factors, including risks, documents, modeling, are based already as a package and have become a commodity. On the other hand, nuclear finance is still in the evolving stage, with various issues, especially government support, completion risk, political risk, supply chain, and others. In between are renewable projects. They have overcome their own challenges if you compare with conventional IPPs, and now seems to have also become a commodity, meaning that there is already a package and you only have to customize it in order to match individual projects. And so here's the question: can SMR financing follow that path of the renewables? In order to answer that question, we would like to identify A, what issues can we solve and overcome in SMR financing by using our past experiences in conventional IPP, renewables, and nuclear finances? And B, what are the challenges that are in common between SMR financing and financing for large-scale reactors? And if any, C, what are the new and unique challenges for SMR financing? Now, after I introduce our 4 panelists we have today, they will make their presentations for around 10 minutes each. Then we will move on to the panel discussion, including the Q&A with the audience for around 30 minutes. Regarding the Q&A, we will not use the blue hands feature today. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A written feature. Also, we kindly ask you for your understanding that although we will try our best, we might not have enough time to answer all the questions submitted. Now, please let me introduce our panelists. Firstly, Dr. John Horst Keppler. Dr. Keppler is a senior economic advisor at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. He is also a professor of economics at the Université Paris Dauphine, where he directs the Chair European Electricity Markets and Masters Energy Finance Carbon, EFC. His principal research is on the competitiveness of low-carbon technologies, such as nuclear energy, taking into account their full costs at the system level. Recent publications include the costs of decarbonization, system costs with high shares of nuclear and renewables in 2019, the full cost of electricity provision in 2018, determining optimal interconnection capacity on the basis of hourly demand and supply functions of electricity in 2018, as well as rationales for capacity remuneration mechanisms in 2017. Professor Keppler intervenes regularly in the media and was, until 2018, a member of the Exchange Council of EPA Spot, the European Electricity Market Operator.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Mr. Paul Murphy, the Managing Director of Murphy Energy and Infrastructure Consulting. Mr. Murphy focuses on multiple aspects of the nuclear industry, from legal and policy matters, including international regulatory and treaty frameworks, and issues regarding nuclear liability, to strategies for creating and financing nuclear power programs, and the identification and mitigation of associated risks, representing developers, owners, investors, lenders, and contractors on nuclear projects internationally. He is recognized as an expert in the development and financing of nuclear power programs by the IAEA, OECD's NEA, IFNEC, and the US government. Paul is an affiliate of Nuclear Economics Consulting Group. He also serves as a consultant to Global Venture Consulting and as special advisor to the Nuclear Alternative Project. Paul currently serves on the IAEA's Technical Cooperation Program Team, which assists member states in developing civilian nuclear power programs. He's a board member of the United Nuclear Industry Alliance, and he serves as director of the New Plant Marketing and Finance Division. Paul is also a member of ASME's Technology Advisory Panel for Clean Energy. He's a 5-time appointee to the US Secretary of Commerce's Civilian Nuclear Trade Advisory Committee. Paul regularly teaches financing, contracting, and project development for the IAEA, Argonne National Laboratory, and Texas A&M University for their international training programs. Most recently, Paul served as Managing Director, Special Projects for the international law firm Gowling WLG. Prior to joining Gowling's, he was Special Counsel in the Washington, D.C. office of Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy LLP, where he was a member of the Global Project Finance Group and led Milbank's nuclear practice. Prior to Milbank, he served as Senior Counsel for Bechtel Power Corporation, supporting both the nuclear and fossil business lines as a transactional attorney involved in bid evaluations, business development, proposal submittals, contract negotiations, procurement, and project execution. Our third panelist is Yiming Li, CFA FRM, Assistant General Manager of Credit and Financing Department at CGN Finance Company Limited since 2018. Yiming began his career in 2007 as a contract management engineer at Daya Bay Nuclear Power Operations and Management Company Limited, a subsidiary of CGN. And in 2010, he led a team to manage procurement of construction projects for the company. In 2015, he started to work for CGN Finance Company. He had 5 years experience in financing for nuclear power projects, one of which was the Hinkley Point C nuclear power projects in the United Kingdom. He holds a master's degree in business administration from Kenan Flagler Business School, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Construction Engineering Management, specializing in international management from Chongqing University, China. And our fourth panelist tonight is Mr. Amjad Gori. Mr. Gori is a seasoned financial advisory executive with more than 25 years of banking and development finance experience, gained from leading and closing multiple first-of-a-kind power, transportation, and social infrastructure projects on a global basis, as a developer with CMS Energy, and more recently as a managing director in Credit Agricole's Structured Finance Advisory Group based in London. In early 2018, established Agias Advisory Limited, a boutique advisory firm providing transaction advisory services in the energy infrastructure, mining and nuclear energy sectors, in affiliation with Nuclear Economics Consulting Group and Global Venture Consulting, respectively. Amjad has been very active in the nuclear sector dating back to 2008, having led financial advisory teams in NPP transactions in Bulgaria, Lithuania, and Finland, working on behalf of private and public sector clients. And between January and June of 2018, had the privilege to be included as part of an expert finance working group comprising of private finance and nuclear industry experts brought together under the aegis of UK's Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, tasked with making recommendations to the UK government on how best to mobilize private sector finance for the design, development and deployment of SMRs in the UK. The EFWG's findings were then presented to the UK government, who has since implemented several of the recommendations. Amjad is also a frequent lecturer on nuclear financing and has conducted several workshops under the IAEA umbrella in various jurisdictions, including the United States, France, and Sri Lanka, as well as other conferences in Abu Dhabi and the University of Leeds. Now, let's move on to the presentations by each panelist. Firstly, Dr. Jan Horst Keppler, Senior Economic Advisor of the NTE Division, would make his presentation titled Public-Private Risk Sharing, its contribution to lowering financing costs and enabling nuclear new build. Dr. Keppler, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Mikita-san. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak at this IFNEC roundtable on SMR financing on private and public options. You just repeated the title of my talk, which is indeed on public-private risk sharing and its contribution to lowering financing costs and enabling nuclear new build. I would like to start off with a number of general points that you're all aware of, but it's useful to recall them in this context. Nuclear, of course, is a proven low-carbon source for large amounts of round-the-clock baseload electricity, providing great benefits. Not all of these benefits are of the private nature, such as electricity production would be, but a number of important benefits are indeed of a public nature. And I just mentioned air quality, climate change. It's stable at the system level, that's very important. It's dispatchable at will. It provides physical inertia. It allows human capital formation and provides energy security as a largely domestic source of electricity. It is thus has some similarities to infrastructure investment. On the other hand, you all know that the construction of a new nuclear power plant presents a complex industrial challenge and presents a number of significant risks in a number of dimensions, and that holds both for Gen 3 reactors that we're perhaps becoming familiar with, and also still for SMRs. In addition, nuclear power plants are highly capital intensive. 80% of its lifetime costs are due before the first megawatt hour is produced. Excuse me. Mindful of those risks, to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs, the different risks need to be carefully allocated to those parties that are best equipped to manage them. There is a case for optimized risk sharing between governments, vendors, investors, operators, and consumers in order to minimize the financial risks and lower the overall costs of nuclear power plants. I tried to put some of these risk dimensions in perspective by mixing colors and concepts, and also to sort of link them to some of the risk-sharing agreements that we mostly talk about. If we come to the design and development phase, most of us would agree that a significant size of the risk should be supported by the vendor. At the same time, government may want to play a role here in terms of its R&D policy, research, development, and perhaps even deployment. Coming to construction risk, things are less clear. That's one of the two big risk dimensions. Different constructions will allocate the risk to different parties. If you have a fixed price contract, it will be the vendor or the contractor. If you have merchant power plant, which is rare in the nuclear field, admittedly, it would be the operator, the investors. Governments might take part of the risk through equity stakes, or consumers through construction such as RAB, construction work in progress. RAB stands for asset-based, regulated asset-based, or long-term PPAs. It's easier with operational risk. We all agree it should be the operator who carries that. In terms of accidents, rare, fortunately, but operators are liable up to a limit, and beyond that, government. When it comes to market, price, and quantity risk, there again, that's one of the big ones. We basically have, on the one hand, the operator investor, or indeed the consumer through contracts for difference or regulated tariff. With regulation and politics, such as nuclear phase-outs, to some extent it's the operators and investors. There's no compensation. Otherwise, it's government. And ideally, government should indeed be the party concerned with political risk. Decommissioning and radioactive waste management comes back to regulation and politics. There are different liability regimes that are being considered or implemented. And it's again between operators, investors, and governments. It's a very complex area, and the NEA is actually currently working on that. Before actually discussing the two big ones, construction risk and operational risk, let us quickly look at what's different for SMRs. First of all, when we talk about SMRs, the category is very large and goes from microreactors in the single-digit megawatt range to baseload providers of 300 megawatts per module and above. The commercially most advanced projects and the ones most likely to come online in the near future are towards the upper end of that range. Projects of scale even larger if you talk about multi-module plants. Even for a single plant, projects are still large. Nevertheless, if you compare that to the size of the typical utility, then it does make a big difference whether you're paying between $1 or $2 billion US for a single module, or 7.5 billion or above for a Gen 3 plant. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that risk has disappeared. Because with SMRs, of course, the big promise to some extent is the ability to build them in large factories instead of stick built, bringing costs down, reducing risks. But that would shift this important part of financial risk to the vendor, who will now have to bear the higher fixed cost for that dedicated factory in parallel or even before market development. So that's the shift of risk. And if you consider that shift of risk, then we might ask ourselves the question whether governments would be more inclined to share into the risk of vendors, the large domestic company building at home, perhaps gearing for exports, or into the risk of operators, where governments have been more reluctant in recent years. So there's a sort of a discussion to be had. SMRs are also new technologies yet to be proven, but they offer greater operational flexibility, smaller core size, and a crucial point, but a very difficult to discuss, and certainly we won't discuss it here, but perhaps offering an easier interaction with regulators, which would of course be highly welcome. Let me now come to the two major risk dimensions, construction risk and market risk. Construction risk, I took slides from other publications from interested parties. The first one on the left is from Moody's, and basically all you need to retain for the time being, of course you can have a look at it at your leisure later on. Building new nuclear, first point, it's complicated. It's complicated, it has been complicated recently, and we're trying to sort of make it less complicated, in particular, of course, on the finance side today. On the right-hand side, we have sort of an illustration what may happen under one of those constructions, where indeed construction risks will be shifted from the constructor or the operator constructor to the consumer under the regulated asset-based model. And you see it varies widely with the internal rate of return going here from 4% to 9%. But look at that statement by EDF Energy at the very bottom. 62 pounds of the current strike price of Hinkley Point C of 92.50 are related to financing, of which more than half is construction risk premium. Now, getting that premium down through ROB is, of course, the whole point. You see, it still varies widely between 36 and 83 pounds per megawatt hour. Overall, however, ROB promises a lower internal rate of return because the risk has been de-risked, and therefore lower long-term costs for consumers. At the same time, consumers would be liable for any overshoot in construction costs. Might also reduce the incentive for the operator to really build at lowest cost, because he can in fact roll over some of the risk to consumers. So there's a real debate to be had. Nevertheless, we also have hybrid RAB schemes now that sort of keep the incentive to some extent for the constructor and for the operator, and only part of that risk to the consumers. So that becomes quite sophisticated. Nevertheless, keep in mind, shifting some of the risk to the consumers may lower overall construction costs. I'll now come to the next point, which is then the market risk. Well, the question is again, how much risk shall the operator, in this case, the plant is built, the constructor has been paid, the operator shall carry, and how much of that the consumer? Now, there are two slides I like a lot. They show a nuclear plant and a gas plant, both with the same levelized cost of electricity, the same discounted average cost. If everything goes well, the two plants cost the same and will yield the same profit. Now imagine that prices fall. Moving from the left to the right in each graph, imagine that prices fall, as has been the case in many markets, due to cheap shale gas or to renewables coming in the market. So that's not something that is completely out of the blue. Prices fall. What happens to the nuclear plant? We have now losses that go into the billions of dollars. We're no longer making any profit. The high fixed costs have been paid, and the losses are very large. On the right-hand side, we have the gas plant exposed to the same fall in prices, but what happens? Basically, they just shut down the gas plant. Fixed costs were not very high anyway, and overall losses are very limited. What does that allow us to conclude? That indeed, the liberalized wholesale market with volatile marginal cost pricing is not a level playing field, but discriminates against capital-intensive low-carbon technologies with high fixed costs. Investment in low-carbon technology inevitably requires some form of stability in electricity prices, which means some transfer of market risk to electricity consumers. And the next slide will go into that. Why, in fact, the cost to consumers of carrying that price risk is indeed much less than for the consumers. The long-term fixed price arrangements, such as contract for difference or PPA, also feed-in tariffs, become valuable for the generators if there are risks of a price fall, as we just discussed. In this case, consumer benefits from the lower wholesale market prices, but will need to pay higher compensation payments to bridge the gap between the market prices and the agreed strike price. The net effect will be second order for consumers, while it would have been first order for the generators. The cost of bearing the risk is thus much higher for the generators than for the consumers. And put differently, in such a fixed price arrangement, consumers forgo the potential upside for them of temporarily lower prices, but obtain the advantage of lower average costs in the long term. Let me put the two together and come to my conclusion. I think I have already reached my limit, and thank you very much for your patience. In many dimensions of risks, design, construction, accidents, regulation, politics, radioactive waste management, governments have a direct role to play. The two largest risks do remain construction risk and market risk. In the case of market risk, I think the argument is straightforward. Consumers lose little in engaging in some form of long-term contract and might gain potentially significantly. In construction risk, similar trade-off may exist. However, the case needs to be made in a somewhat more differentiated manner. Regulated asset base or construction work in progress have consumers assume potential downside risks. They also need to be carefully designed to maintain incentives for efficiency. There is an alternative that needs also to be carefully judged. Lower the cost of capital directly, loan guarantee, fiscal incentives, direct public equity stakes. Final trade-offs need to be made on empirical grounds according to the specific characteristics of each project. The arguments for Gen 3 reactors and SMRs, I think, are not fundamentally different. That, to some extent, answers part of the challenge that was set up by the chairman at the beginning, except that with the latter, some risks will shift to the pre-construction phase of an individual plant, to that phase of factory construction of the single components, which I think is a phase that is now becoming the big challenge and which needs to be thought through very, very carefully. Finally, electricity consumers, taxpayers, and voters are the same people, although we sometimes don't think of them that way, but they are. The external benefits of nuclear that I mentioned earlier, in particular, local pollution and climate change, are an important argument to engage in broad, well-prepared, and adequately communicated forms of public-private risk sharing. There is a role for public involvement in the financing of new nuclear projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. Now we will listen to Mr. Paul Murphy from Murphy Energy and Infrastructure Consulting with the title Financing an SMR Project, Considerations from the Financial Community. Mr. Murphy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mikita-san, and good day, everyone. I'd like to just begin by thanking everyone for being here today, and my gratitude to the IFNEC Secretariat for asking me to serve on this panel. If we could jump down 2 slides, please. Again and again. One more. So really what we see historically with nuclear is that financing is probably the greatest challenge for NPP development. And the exciting thing about SMRs is the potential for a paradigm shift, which then can create new opportunities for financing. And some of the things that you've heard, which I'll try to explore a little bit more in this brief amount of time, is the lower aggregate cost for the units relative to large reactors, the shorter construction period, the hoped for greater construction certainty with factory assembly, and then the idea that these can be scaled for development and sort of right-sized to fit conditions that might not be applicable to large reactors. And then on top of it, some of those new applications like desalination, hydrogen production, some of the things that go beyond just the simple production of electricity and looking at the combination of that power and heat source to do other things. Next slide, please. When we talk about financing, at the end of the day, it really comes down to developing a project. And so when you think in terms of project development opportunities, the first thing is just the simple fact that the lower cost means that you need to source less financing. So the burden should be less. When you lower that burden, you start to think about new opportunities in terms of things like even balance sheet financing. If we all recall, you know, at the beginning of this century, the last decade, when people were talking about a nuclear renaissance, one of the things that was brought out is that given the cost of large reactors, it became a bet the company proposition for developers, and therefore it made it difficult to take these projects on balance sheet. With shorter construction, you're accruing less interest during construction, which again reduces the aggregate cost of financing in terms of the quantum. And hopefully by shortening that period of project development, there's less of an equity hold for equity investors who may not want to take long project development and construction risk and tie up that equity for long periods of time. When we look at scalability and you think of a project that may be 1,200 megawatts all or nothing, you know, now doing multiple units over time, each one being easier in itself to finance and then generating revenue that can be used to support further financing starts to get exciting. And then importantly, from a financing perspective, you always have to address the question of contingency. And if there's uncertainty as to whether that cost and schedule can be achieved, then the demand for contingency as part of the financing package becomes very important. With lower costs and shorter construction periods, we should be able to evaluate the need for contingency in a different way. Not that it goes away, but perhaps it is reduced. Next slide, please. So when we think about financing sources, we have to think about sources and structures. And I've listed some sources and structures that we've seen for debt and equity. Again, we don't have the time to go through all of these, but the one thing that I would raise is the idea of possible strategic investors coming into the SMR space, and the idea that maybe sovereign wealth funds could be a source of financing as you look at it from an industrial development strategy. But I think the important thing when we talk about financing is what is that structure behind the project to make it make sense? You know, do we have a viable offtake structure? You heard some ideas from Jan about how, you know, we look at the offtake, how we look at, you know, the viability of the sale of electricity over what time, over what price, in what environment, who the owners are. can we refinance these so that we take the lower risk period and the financing opportunities there to maybe reduce the exposure for the higher risk period and the hold of the debt and equity that has to come in that place. Fiscal policies, clean energy support, guarantees, these are all the tools that we put around a structure to make it more viable. And frankly, these issues, these structural issues, are relevant both to large and small reactor financing. Next slide, please. So when we get to the fundamentals, again, this theme of having viable project economics around a project to attract technology. Proven technology, which I put in red because obviously SMRs have to overcome that challenge, but the need for creditworthy parties, experienced parties, dealing with reputational risk issues so that it is a good project in the nuclear context and the things that are associated with this. The importance of sustained government support, again, to make this project viable and sustainable over time. And then, of course, country risk, which is not unique to large projects or small projects, but is it easy or hard to do business in the country? These are things that financiers will look at. The challenges for nuclear, of course, when you look at those newcomer countries, no difference in terms of large versus small versus some of the program issues you need to deal with. But these market conditions that we face that are detrimental to nuclear development, they have to be addressed, of course. Regulatory risk is another challenge. But then we see two things in terms of, as I mentioned before, the construction period, the construction costs. I put those in green because now we see maybe an opportunity for SMRs. And then one of the last points that I would just highlight is, as we try to justify these projects, especially in asking for government support, fiscal policy, how do we monetize those intangible benefits that are part of a nuclear project? How do we capture that when they don't necessarily fit into financial models? Because that may not be relevant for some of the debt and equity people looking at this deal, but it certainly will be from a government and from a policy perspective. Next slide, please. So, we have a structure in place with the IAEA, the 19 milestones. Funding and financing is obviously one of those milestones, but that is sort of the way we think of how to develop projects. Next slide, please. The interesting thing, though, is when we compare the IAEA guidance, we have the 2007 guidance, which is really for large reactors, and then we have the 2012 guidance for research reactors. The notable point, of course, is we have nothing specific for SMRs yet, but we see that even in this guidance, we see a 50% reduction in time from going from a large reactor to a research reactor. And when we start reducing time, that gets to be very relevant in terms of where we might be able to consider various sources of financing support, especially on the equity side when you're reducing that development period. Next slide, please. So when we think about SMR differentiators, some of these I've already talked about. But I think what gets to be interesting is, can we unlock clean energy finance for SMRs? Can we get nuclear special treatment like other types of clean generation? And I think that's one of the challenges and one of the opportunities, of course. Can we start to think of modeling projects a little bit differently when we start focusing more on the application of the technology to something else? And does that open up the possibility of industrial investment? We talked about scaling those designs and development so that maybe a large reactor isn't suitable for the grid size. So maybe doing it in more bite-sized chunks not only is more achievable from a financing perspective, but it also makes sense from a grid structuring perspective. And we see that now it becomes less of an all or nothing proposition. But from a challenges perspective, we still don't have a comprehensive SMR development approach. We still have first of a kind risk. We have to harmonize regulatory processes and licensing so that we can deploy these faster. And unfortunately, we're still in this phase where SMRs are more viewed in terms of a technology development exercise as opposed to a project development exercise. And from a technology development exercise, it's about getting one built, getting it licensed, getting it demonstrated. But we need to move that into the project development space where we focus on deployment and financing. And we need that sort of off-the-shelf deployment model so that we can go faster. The reality of SMRs for the companies is that it has to be a volume business. You have to sell a lot of these things to survive. So how can we create that environment without compromising safety, security, and safeguards so that countries can enter the market faster, so that we have more buyers available for the technologies as they come to market? And again, we go back to the need for government support, which is a recurring theme. We need government support at multiple levels to get these technologies to market, demonstrated, and then deployed. And it's a combination of all of these roles, both for the host countries where the projects are, but also for the host countries where the technologies are being developed. So I think at the end of the day, what we get to is some of the financing techniques could be sized and used for SMRs, but the project still has to make sense, whether it's a large or small reactor. That project development mentality still has to be there. You still look at the project the same way, albeit now you may have some benefits that you can capture differently. And from an equity perspective, where we like to see the equity come in at the project level, maybe there are opportunities for that equity to come in at the technology development level and possibly as part of a larger industrial development strategy. So if we can move to the concluding slide. I think when we talk about financing, somehow there's this view that maybe there's some magic financing technique that hasn't been created yet. I think the reality is that what we see is that the tools are out there if we really want to do it, if we really want to put the policies in place, if we really want to deploy. And that's where you get into things like government support, having viable project sponsors, having solid credit behind the deal, applying fiscal tools to enhance the economics and viability of the project. And then, of course, delivering that project. It's fine to say we're going to have factory construction, but then you have to ask the SMR vendor, well, where's your factory? If you don't have a factory, what are we talking about? And that's, again, an area where maybe government support can come into place to help build those factories, as an example. Regulatory development, economics, and then, of course, stakeholder engagement. When we convince people of the necessity of nuclear, of the need to deploy these technologies to meet some of the challenges we face, we get the policy tools, we get the fiscal tools, we get the financing tools that we need, because these things are financeable, but you need that push coming from the policy side so that people really want to do this. If they really want to do it, they are financeable, and we can apply a lot of interesting techniques to them. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. Now, we would like to ask Mr. Yiming Lee, the General Manager Assistant of Credit Finance Department, CGN Finance, for his presentation titled Experience Sharing on Financing for Taishan EPR Project. Yiming, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you all for being here today. And I really appreciate for the opportunity to share the experience in financing for Taishan project. Next slide, please. So next slide. So first, let us take a quick look at the project. The Taishan nuclear power project plans to build 6 nuclear generating units, and its phase 1 comprises 2 EPR units with a single unit capacity of 1750 gigawatts. The phase 1 project is jointly invested by China General Nuclear Power Corporation, CGN, Electricité de France, EDF, and the Guangdong Energy Group. Next slide, please. So the 2 units have been put into commercial operation in December 2018 and September 2019, respectively. And the 2 units have been maintaining a safe and reliable operations all along. Next slide, please. So next slide. One more. Okay. As we know that the third generation nuclear power plants typically involve high construction cost and long construction duration, and thus involve significant risks which concern financiers. And there are mainly four particular risks related to nuclear power projects. The first one is project abandon risk, because there was no reactor with EPR technology in operation when Taishan project began construction, so leading to risks that the project may be far behind schedule or even be abandoned. The second one is the over-budgeting risk due to the potential unexpected technical issues of the new technology. The project may be over-budgeted significantly. And the third one is the consumption risk. The power generated by the project may not be fully consumed by future electricity market. And the last one, the electricity tariff risk. In China, the tariff is normally determined right before power plants are put into operation based on the market price. Therefore, it may be lower than expected. Next one. So in order to address these risks, the factors on this slide we consider are more important for achieving a successful financing. Healthy economic environment, favorable policy, strong, experienced, and trustworthy investors, outstanding project management team, and well-designed credit structure. And next slide. So with regard to economic environment, the China's economy has maintained consistent high-speed growth rate, about 6% as of 2019, and which pushed the steady increase of the energy demand. And the right graph showed that nuclear power generation, as well as its proportion to the total generation, has been increasing steadily. So in view of advantages of nuclear energy in the electricity market, investors and financial institutions have developed positive attitudes toward nuclear energy. Next slide, please. So the government policy is also a very important factor taken into account by financial institutions to assess loans to project a nuclear power project. The state has put into place a series of favorable policies in support of nuclear energy development, consumption, and electricity tariff setting. For example, in 2007, the state released the Nuclear Power Medium Long-Term Development Plan. And in 2018, the state issued the Clean Energy Consumption Action Plan, which prioritized the power generation of clean energy, including nuclear power. In 2019, the electricity price for Taishan project was set at a favorable level. Next slide, please. So talking about investor strength, CGN is the largest nuclear power developer and operator in China and has an experience of more than 25 years in nuclear power construction, operation, and management. And EDF is also the largest nuclear power operator in Europe, and it's in the list of Fortune 500 companies. And the Guangdong Energy Group has a minority stake in the project, and it's confined its place in Guangdong province. So investor strength reduces the risks related to project completion. Next slide. Shareholder capital accounts for 33% of total investment, providing a safe cushion of funding needs and attracting bank loans. Next slide. So pertaining to excellent project management team initiated by CGN, the Taishan EPR project coordination committee was established by the main investors, constructors, and equipment suppliers of the project, So all parties deal with various problems encountered in the construction of the project in accordance with the principle of priority and technical quality and schedule controls. An excellent project management team helps to reduce the risks related to project abandon. Next slide. So a well-designed credit structure is also critical for successful financing for the project. There are two main sources of financing for the project. The left part of the graph shows that the Chinese bank syndicate provided a loan which covers almost 80% of total debt financing. The credit structure is that the shareholders provided letters of completion commitment to commit that they will not abandon the project, and the project company provided a pledge of electricity charge right and transferred the insurance benefits to the bank syndicate. The right part of the graph shows the export-backed credit loan, which covers about 20% of total debt financing and covers 85% of contract prices in euro of equipment imported from France, and as well as insurance premium paid to La Coffice, which is the credit insurance company. And in this structure, a unique feature that differs from a regular export-backed credit structure is that it introduced two Chinese banks, the BOC, which is Bank of China, and CDB, which is China Development Bank. They all have a very high credit ratings, especially for CDB. It has a credit rating equals to that of government sovereign loan. So it reduces the credit risk of the project company for the final lenders. So next slide. So next slide. So let's come to the conclusion that if we want to achieve a successful financing for nuclear power projects, we need to consider the following factors: the healthy economic environment, policy support for clean energy, investors with economic strength, experience, and trustworthiness, excellent project management team, and well-designed credit structure. And that's all for my presentation, and thank you all.
Thank you, Yiming, for your presentation. Now we have Mr. Amjad Gori, the Managing Director of AGS Advisory Limited, for his presentation titled UK Government Role in Design, Development, Financing and Deployment of SMRs in the UK. Amjad, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mikita-san. Next slide, please. Thank you for having me here. I thank you for allowing me to speak. My presentation is going to focus primarily on SMRs, and it's based on based on my experience of spending 6 months with the expert finance working group under the auspices of BASE. And I think the UK government had realized that there was a market failure and something needed to be done. And so they got a bunch of, especially in promotion of nuclear projects, so they gathered a bunch of experts, and we spent over the period of 6 months, we reviewed and analyzed all the risk specifics to small nuclear. We all knew about the large nuclear, but we wanted to see, how different were the risks related to small nuclear. And then we analyzed each of the risks. We spoke to each of the vendors that were promoting small technologies. And then after that, we explored a range of potential financing models for SMRs, which we also, as you'll see, we explored 9, but we decided on 2 that were project finance based, and another one which is a regulated asset based model. Ultimately, what we did was delivered a set of concrete recommendations to assist Her Majesty's government to de-risk perceived and real risks. And I think what we concluded was that the government need to play a big role. And there's no getting around this, especially if you're at the forefront of developing and deploying a technology that hasn't yet been proven. So what you'll see is the way that we, after all the stuff that we did, the way that we went about it is we looked at evidence from multiple interviews with vendors, we developed the risk register, we examined financing structures, and finally we said, okay, here are a couple of structures, and not only that, but here's some policy recommendations. And at the end of this exercise, we concluded that the government could be well placed to develop a first of a kind small reactor projects that fall within the $2.5 billion range, sterling range by 2030. Next slide, please. I mean, I'm really not going to speak much about this slide because, my predecessors have already kind of focused on why SMRs. A lot of these are sort of intuitive versus the large-scale nuclear projects, but a lot of things that didn't work on the nuclear side, have a greater potential of working here. Modularization, modularity. We need, but what do they require? They require a policy framework that with financial support, and it also requires the fleet approach. And of course, the fleet approach goes hand in hand with the nth of a kind, because that's where you're really going to see the benefits in terms of a levelized cost of electricity, over the longer period. Next slide, please. Okay, I mean, I think I've touched a little bit on the methodology and the premise. We concluded sort of early in the process, and that you have to have especially to get a first of a kind project off, you need to have government, and you need the government involvement to motivate and catalyze private sector financing. Otherwise, it doesn't work. I'm a 25-year practitioner of project finance, and as much as people talk about project finance as a methodology, it just doesn't work in nuclear. You can use the project finance discipline, which I think is a fantastic discipline, to assess the risks in a nuclear project. But I don't think, you're not going to get nuclear done on a project finance basis without some sort of completion risk from the sponsors or from the government. So some of the things we looked at, the impact on the balance sheet, impact on policy, is the structure, ability to attract debt, cost to consumers, taxpayers, is ease of setting up, risk allocation, what about revenue risk, and then what's the maximum gearing that these projects can bear, and of course the ever important thing of WACC, weighted average cost of capital, and how do you reduce the WACC so that cost of financing will be cheaper, therefore the projects will ultimately be cheaper. So we looked at four, next slide, please. So this is just, I'm just leaving it here. I wanted you to see, this is typically a risk register that we do, that we did, and then an advisor should be able to do this for you. And it looks at all the risks, and my colleagues have covered this in previous presentations, but it basically allocates the risks, and on the right-hand side, you'll see, some comments related to the allocation of that risk. Next slide, please. So as I said, the first thing we looked at was, okay, you're talking about a PF base, that is you're dependent on the revenues from the project for the repayment of the debt, but with a CFD, which is a contract for difference, and a PPA with UK government as an investor. So this is UK government saying, okay, we're gonna give you something that's going to mitigate your revenue risk, which is a CFD, and as well as a PPA. And then we're also going to invest as a super investor. So something like this, strengthens the transaction in the eyes of co-investors, lenders, and other project participants. Has an impact on the balance sheet, but it will catalyze private sector financing, and it's very helpful and necessary for first-of-a-kind projects. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit different. Instead of an investor, the government plays a role as a guarantor. Another thing, very helpful to attract debt. It has a huge balance sheet impact, but this is what's needed. But the flip side is the positive whack to lower financing costs, and that also helps the project. Next slide, please. Just before I go into the RAB model, I just briefly, UK government did all of this. They did, when they proposed something for the Horizon, their offer for the Horizon NPP, which unfortunately was not accepted, where UK government was a investor. It offered a CFD, and it also offered to guarantee a large portion of the debt. So UK government is actually doing things, they're just not saying this, but they're actually going to do it. And then, from an SMR perspective, we think, my colleagues and I, we think that a regulated asset-based model will maybe something that works, because there's a real risk sharing here. And I think that's what's going to be needed to get SMR financing concluded. Next slide, please. So I'm hopefully cognizant of the time. As somebody said earlier, I think Mikita-san said that we could spend 2 days on these topics, and so trying to jam them all into 8-10 minutes is hard. But I hope you get a flavor of the complexities, but also the experience of some countries like the UK, who have done a great job, in my view, of pushing this along. So it's absolutely, my concluding comments is that essential to establish a transparent regulatory framework that addresses nuclear liability, change in law, political risk, to create a baseline financing support structure that clearly addresses allocation. And you need to be ready to use your balance sheet at all stages of the project life cycle. Otherwise, you're just not going to get there. Design risk. Maybe you provided help in the front end in return for IP rights, manufacturing risk. So all these risks, the government has to play a role. And when this kind of a cooperative effort between government and the private sector, I think you're going to see SMRs ultimately get to at least commercial viability on some of the technologies that are leading, which is NuScale, Rolls-Royce, and others. Next slide, please. So what I've done, this is the next couple of pages of what the UK government has done since, on their SMR initiative. I'm not going to speak about it, but at least it's there. And you can have a look, and of course, available for questions at any time. So thank you.
Thank you, Amjad, for your presentation. Maybe my hypothesis at the beginning was too aggressive or ambitious in other ways after listening to all your presentations. Maybe I would firstly ask Yiming one question regarding your experience of the Taishan project. What will be new or different from the risk standpoint when you are to structure an SMR project? Or do you think it will be structured basically using the Taishan project as a platform? Do you see any differences between SMR financing and your experience with the Taishan project?
Okay, thank you for your question. I think it's a quite good question. And with regard to the first SMR, as well as the follow-on SMRs that are not expected to be cost competitive in the near term, they will be fundamentally different from the Taishan project in terms of risk profile. So from the perspective of financial institutions, although the Taishan project utilized the new third generation technology, they consider it as incremental innovation based on former mature nuclear power technologies. And thus the risks of a Taishan project are contained and foreseeable. However, they perceive SMR technologies as brand new technologies, which are untested and uneconomical. Therefore, the credit risks are significantly higher for the first SMR than that of the Taishan project. So in fact, I have communicated with one of the banks in China with the recommendation that the project company needs to implement some credit enhancement measures in order to obtain loans from financial institutions, such as letting the parent company with higher credit ratings provide a loan guarantee to ensure the repayment of the loan, principal plus the interest. But once the SMRs become more profitable due to the scale of economy, they will be much similar to other nuclear power projects in terms of financing. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Yiming. Then may I ask a question to all the panelists? All of you kindly mentioned the opportunities for SMRs and also the challenges that they face. Taking that into account, for instance, if we assume that we have the first SMR project now in operation and the first of a kind risk and other risks have been somehow managed, then when you look at the modularity, meaning that you have following commercial SMR projects in front of you, do you see the future of SMR projects and also the finance related to SMR to be much more common and practical as, for instance, the renewable IPP projects now? Or do you think it will be still similar to today's financing for large-scale reactors? This question comes from my way of seeing your presentation and your conclusions, your views, that it seems SMRs are still quite similar to the large-scale reactors rather than following renewables or other IPP projects in the market. How are your thoughts?
I think you mentioned two things that are interesting words to use in this context: renewables and IPP. And I think that when we look at SMRs in terms of the viability of the project and the financing to support it, IPPs are intended to really be developed, on the strength of their economics. And then you have to look at the market in which this is intending to operate. And so, in deregulated electricity markets, nuclear has had a problem. We're not seeing the developed in deregulated markets unless there's all kinds of support surrounding them. And I don't know that that's going to change anytime soon if electricity markets aren't properly valuing some of the intangibles that I mentioned in my presentation and that Jan mentioned in terms of the total system costs of electricity. not to attack renewables. Renewables are very important, but they're getting a lot of benefits that other forms of generation aren't. And then people like to say, well, why can't nuclear compete? You know, and so fine that we're supporting renewables, but it is intermittent generation, and it creates a lot of challenges that aren't being accounted for. And then we're trying to put nuclear into that environment. So I think, you know, nuclear needs a bit of a protected environment, not to say that it doesn't have some accountability for cost and schedule and economics, but in the current deregulated environment that we see in most places, it's very hard for nuclear to compete against other forms of generation when some of the factors that nuclear benefit from aren't accounted for, and some of the factors that other forms of generation have that might negatively impact them aren't imposed. And so I think that we have to balance these things, which gets into, you know, do we want nuclear power at all, and where do we see it in our electricity portfolio future in the context of clean generation and elsewhere? And if we can make that case, then you can put in place the supports that can finance these things. But in deregulated markets, absent that analysis, I don't see it happening on an IPP basis.
Could I come quickly in on that, Chairman? I think there is a case for having a vision where indeed one day SMRs might be more similar to, let's say, to a gas-fired power plant or to a renewable project, basically a commoditized project in which sort of we have set financing procedures and all that, and the technological confidence. But we're at least a decade away from that. So how do we get from now, where indeed Paul's analysis fully applies, if you don't have some sort of support, it will not just sort of happen by itself. From now to that vision where perhaps one day, indeed, small modular nuclear reactors will be financed by private parties, come on their own economic merits. And there I truly think, and I mentioned it sort of perhaps not strongly enough, but I think the key point is that point of factory build. Sort of, we need to get sort of these enormous fixed costs, these enormous sort of building that infrastructure that could potentially one day churn out the SMRs, commoditized. But we need to think about that sort of first step of building the infrastructure for that. And that inevitably will require some sort of significant commitment by public bodies.
I just want to echo Jan's comments. I mean, you know, one of the key things, especially if you're talking about SMR growth, that supply chain investment, which runs into the billions, has to be there, and that's the basis on which you will also be able to do the fleet concept. You know, you can't do an SMR as a one of a kind. It's got to be in volume, because that's the nth of a kind, is where you're going to get the LCOE benefits. But in order to do that, you're going to have to spend money to establish that structure.
Okay. Since okay, so since the folk risk has been somehow managed, the question will be how to handle the risk related to whether or not SMRs are profitable, from my opinion. So before the SMRs become profitable or economical, the credit of SMRs has to be enhanced through parent company guarantee or third-party guarantees to get financed. And the government needs to provide some form of subsidy to such projects. For example, to provide an appropriate electricity tariff to enable the projects profitable to investors. But when the SMRs become profitable or economical, if we do not consider the security issues and regulations related to nuclear power projects, the future of SMRs financing, I think will be quite similar to today's IPP projects. So in addition, because of the smaller cost of and shorter term construction, SMRs will attract more small private financial investors. However, if we consider the security issues and the regulations upon the nuclear industry, the SMRs will be much more like the large-scale nuclear projects.
Thank you all for your comments. Before I ask further questions regarding the time left for us, do you have any comments to the questions submitted from the audience?
I have to admit, Mikita-san, I've been answering them on the sly, a couple of them. So there's 26.
Sorry, Amjad, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Oh, I'm not on mute.
Yes, now we can. Yep.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. No, I said I've been answering a few on the slides. So, but there's 26 different questions. And I think one of the questions that, if I may just look at, they asked about BOO and BOOT, whether these are viable models for nuclear. And I think the answer is no. I think we just need to look at TVO OL3 as an example. I happen to work as financial advisor for TVO on the OL4 project. And that, you know, after a year or so of working on it, that was canceled because OL3 hadn't got to where it needed to be. But, you know, OL3, the understanding at the time was that, hey, we're bidding, this is a world-class, you know, companies, world-class group of companies. Why can't we let them do this on their own? And unfortunately, nuclear is so complex that it didn't happen. So to mitigate that in OL4, what TVO was intending to do was, before they made the actual selection, once they made the selection, they were actually going to work for 2 years with the vendor to finalize design and provide their own money for them to do it, so that when they got to that final design stage, there weren't going to be any questions about the technology. So BOO, BOOT is difficult.
Thanks, Jad. Yes, Paul, please.
I would say, you know, looking at the comments, there's a good bit about environmental connections to SMRs and their future, and I think that, you know, it's very nice to say that SMRs have a role to play in a clean energy future. I believe that. I think it's critical, but I go back to my point of needs to be a volume business. In order to have the impact that we want, a lot of these have to be deployed, you know, in a lot of countries. The developing world particularly is an opportunity, given their needs for electrification and population growth issues, water scarcity growth issues. And you put these all together and you see that nuclear clearly has a place to play. But, you know, in some circles, it's still not considered under, you know, clean energy definitions. And I think we need to get past that. We see some movement in the environmental community, but certainly not enough. And I think that we need, you know, more leadership at the highest levels to drive that result, because, you know, we've seen enough scholarship out there from, you know, what I would consider to be relatively neutral institutions, pointing out the essential role that nuclear has to play, not to the exclusion of other things, but without getting nuclear into the right taxonomy and treatment, it will underachieve. And in the context of SMRs, underachieving means, you know, we lack that volume. And so I think we need to focus on that taxonomy. We need to focus on, you know, going back to that IPP question or Jan's question about the future, getting to sort of an off-the-shelf offering, getting to standardized deployment models that include how countries develop their programs, how they do contracting, how they do financing, you know, all these things, so that the greater the standardization, and we talk about that generally in technology and design, but we need it standardized in terms of program development and project development, so that the adjustments at a country level become less and less, so that we can sell more of these things to achieve the goals that we want. I think we have to think of it as a tool as opposed to something like a car that we're trying to sell and compete just as a product like any other. I think that when you start considering it more as a tool to achieve certain goals, you start to reach different conclusions from policy analysis that then unlocks the financing structures that we need and that we're already familiar with that can drive the technology forward.
Cool. Yes, I was going to ask further questions, but regarding the time, thank you, the panelists, for sharing us your views and opinions. I'm sure after the 90 minutes we had today, I'm sure we have been able to raise the key issues that we need to follow and also consider in the coming months and years. But at least for a kind of a comprehensive discussion on SMRs that will continue the next 3 weeks at IFNEC, and also with the opportunity before long to have further discussions in depth related to finance. I'm sure we were able to share our audiences about the future challenges, but also opportunities from the financier's perspective on SMRs. Thank you again for your attendance, my great panelists, and also thank you very much to all the audiences today. With that, I'll hand it back to Totoki-san. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mikita-san.
Thank you. Thank you for all presentation and the valuable discussion of the distinguished panelists and Mr. Mikita. I hope that all of you will bring back the issues discussed today and will continue the conversation for the future of SMR financing. This IFNEC webinar is just a starting point for the conversation. In addition, I'd like to express high expectation for the holding SMR workshop in person in the near future as originally planned. The next webinar will be held from 12 o'clock Paris time on June 16th. The theme is SMR licensing. We look forward to your participation again at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think everybody is
Thank you very much.
available to send follow-up questions. I think they'll all be managed through IFNEC. So please feel free to send if your questions haven't been answered, and if you have more questions, we remain available. Thank you.